What the story reveals about everything we've discussed is how thoroughly social change can occur through quiet individual decisions rather than dramatic institutional reform. The flesh trade didn't end through government regulation, religious condemnation, or medical revolution. It ended through customer preferences, gradually shifting toward treatments that were more effective and less socially embarrassing than consuming processed criminals. How this connects to our broader exploration demonstrates the persistence of psychological and commercial dynamics that transcend specific historical practices. The same needs that drove Maria Kleist to purchase ground-up criminals, desire for traditional authenticity, fear of abandoning proven remedies, social pressure to maintain family medical practices, continue operating in contemporary contexts, where people make healthcare decisions based on tradition, authority, and social expectations rather than careful evaluation of evidence. The memorable final image from Hoffman's record shows him carefully wrapping the last portion of mummy powder in brown paper, writing detailed preparation instructions in his precise handwriting, and accepting payment from a customer who genuinely believed she was purchasing sophisticated medicine rather than participating in systematic cannibalism. The mundane nature of this final transaction reveals how completely European society had normalized practices that should have been recognized as obviously evil. This story connects to everything we've explored because it demonstrates how institutional corruption operates through normal human relationships rather than dramatic criminal conspiracies. How social change occurs through gradual shifts in customer preferences rather than revolutionary transformation, and how easily people can participate in systematic exploitation while maintaining their self-perception as responsible, caring individuals seeking the best possible outcomes for themselves and their families. As we reach the end of tonight's journey through the fascinating and horrifying world of pharmaceutical cannibalism, it's worth reflecting on what this forgotten chapter of medical history teaches us about human nature, institutional authority, and the persistent challenge of distinguishing between genuine expertise and sophisticated fraud disguised as medical advancement. The story of European flesh trading reminds us that obvious moral violations can become socially acceptable through gradual institutional legitimization, that expensive treatments aren't necessarily effective treatments, and that respected authorities can systematically exploit vulnerable populations while maintaining their claims to ethical and intellectual superiority. These lessons remain relevant for anyone navigating contemporary medical systems, where commercial interests sometimes conflict with patient welfare. But perhaps the most important insight from our exploration is that understanding how past societies normalize systematic evil can help us recognize similar patterns in our own time, creating opportunities to address ongoing vulnerabilities to exploitation before they develop into the kind of comprehensive institutional corruption that characterized centuries of European pharmaceutical cannibalism. Thanks for joining me on this journey through one of history's strangest and most troubling medical practices. Take care of yourselves. Think carefully about the treatments you accept, and remember that the most sophisticated sounding expertise isn't always the most trustworthy. As the sounds of the night settle around us and we prepare to close this particular chapter of human history, there's something oddly comforting about the fact that pharmaceutical cannibalism has become nothing more than a historical curiosity, a bizarre footnote in the long story of human medical experimentation that ended not through dramatic moral awakening, but through the quiet triumph of treatments that actually worked over those that merely appeared sophisticated. The European flesh trade ultimately failed, not because people suddenly recognized that eating criminals was ethically problematic, but because customers gradually discovered that plant medicines and chemical compounds were more effective, more reliable, and less socially awkward than consuming processed human remains. This practical triumph of effectiveness over tradition provides a gentle reminder that human societies do occasionally make progress, even if that progress is motivated more by convenience than moral enlightenment. There's also something deeply human about the way pharmaceutical cannibalism disappeared, not through legislative bans or religious condemnation, but through the accumulated decisions of individual customers who simply stopped buying products that seemed primitive compared to available alternatives. The end came through thousands of small choices by ordinary people who decided they preferred plant-based remedies to ground-up criminals, creating market forces that gradually eliminated systematic cannibalism without requiring anyone to acknowledge the full moral implications of previous practices. This gentle ending reflects the complex nature of social change, which often occurs through practical adaptations rather than dramatic moral revelations. European society didn't suddenly develop ethical sophistication that made cannibalistic medicine unacceptable. It gradually developed medical alternatives that made human flesh remedies seem obsolete. The transition was more about technological progress than moral advancement, though the practical result was the elimination of systematic evil disguised as sophisticated healthcare. The story also offers hope that other forms of institutional exploitation might disappear through similar processes of practical obsolescence, as people discover better alternatives to systems that prioritize commercial interests over human welfare. Just as European customers gradually abandoned flesh merchants in favor of plant medicine specialists, contemporary patients might gradually abandon healthcare systems to treat them as profit centers rather than human beings deserving ethical care. Perhaps most comforting is the recognition that the same human vulnerabilities that made pharmaceutical cannibalism possible, desperation for effective treatment, trust in expert authority, desire for social prestige through expensive medicine, can also drive demand for genuinely beneficial healthcare when better options become available. The psychological needs that created markets for human flesh remedies can redirect toward supporting medical systems that actually help people rather than exploiting their desperation. The fade into historical obscurity that has claimed pharmaceutical cannibalism suggests that even the most thoroughly normalized forms of systematic evil can become unthinkable when underlying conditions change. European society didn't require moral revolution to abandon centuries of medical cannibalism. It just needed access to treatments that were obviously superior to consuming dead criminals, combined with gradual recognition that sophisticated-sounding expertise isn't always trustworthy. This quiet triumph of practical wisdom over institutional authority provides a peaceful note on which to end our exploration of one of history's strangest medical practices. The European flesh trade serves as both warning about human capacity for systematic evil and reassurance about human capacity for quiet, practical progress, reminding us that the most important changes often occur through accumulated individual choices rather than dramatic institutional reforms. Sleep well, knowing that your local pharmacy is stocked with remedies that don't require systematic grave robbing to maintain inventory, and that the worst excesses of European pharmaceutical history have faded into well-deserved obscurity through the simple process of people gradually choosing better alternatives when they became available. Next, Thomas would casually stroll past the stables, where he'd overhear the stable boys discussing how the king's horse came back muddy yesterday from a ride to the castle walls. Translation: the king is worried about the castle's defenses, which means he's expecting trouble. Any jokes about castle security, weak walls, or home invasions are now firmly in the career suicide category. Then came the most dangerous part of his intelligence gathering: eavesdropping on the royal chambers. Thomas would position himself near the Queen's quarters, pretending to practice his juggling while actually listening to heated conversations about tax collections, marriage alliances, and which lords were getting a little too big for their britches. One morning, he overheard Queen Isabella complaining about a particular duke who'd been too friendly at the last feast. Thomas filed this information away in his mental comedy vault, not to make jokes about it, but to know exactly what not to joke about when that duke was present. The real artistry came during the actual court sessions. Picture this. King John is holding court, and a group of barons are complaining about taxes. The tension is rising, voices are getting louder, and several hands are moving towards sword hilts. This is where Thomas earned his keep. He'd waddle into the middle of the argument, trip over his own feet spectacularly, and while everyone was laughing at his clumsiness, he'd deliver a carefully crafted joke but somehow address the tax issue without taking sides. "Your Majesty," Thomas might say while picking himself up off the floor, "I've been thinking about taxes, and I've realized they're like my juggling. Everyone expects me to keep all the balls in the air, but half the time, I'm just hoping nothing falls on my head." The barons would laugh, the king would chuckle, and somehow the mood would shift from potential civil war to manageable political disagreement. But here's the really clever part. That joke actually contained 3 layers of meaning. On the surface, it was self-deprecating humor about his own clumsiness. 1 layer deeper, it acknowledged that governing was difficult and that everyone was doing their best to keep things running smoothly. But at the deepest level, it was a subtle reminder that when governments fail, it's usually the little people who get hurt, and nobody wanted to be responsible for dropping those particular balls. One jester allegedly saved an entire village from being burned down by making a joke about how the king's new haircut made him look like a sheep that had been sheared by a blind barber. The king was so amused by this observation that he forgot he was angry about the village's tax rebellion. Another example involved a jester who prevented a war by comparing 2 feuding kingdoms to his own feet. They're always fighting with each other, but they both have to walk in the same direction or I fall flat on my face. The metaphor was so perfectly timed that both sides agreed to peace negotiations rather than risk looking like the foot that caused the jester to stumble. But it wasn't that simple. The biggest complication in a jester's life wasn't just avoiding execution. It was navigating the impossible contradictions of their position. They were supposed to be wise, but appear foolish, be trusted but remain outsiders, speak truth but never be serious, and most paradoxically, be completely honest while constantly lying about who they really were. Consider the fundamental contradiction. Jesters were often the most educated people in the court, but they had to pretend to be simpletons. Many were fluent in multiple languages, well-read in philosophy and politics, and sophisticated enough to understand complex diplomatic situations. Yet their entire job depended on everyone believing they were just lucky idiots who accidentally stumbled into wisdom. It's like being a brain surgeon who has to pretend to be confused by bandages while performing open-heart surgery. Then there was the trust paradox. Kings would confide their deepest fears, darkest secrets, and most dangerous plans to their jesters, treating them as the most trusted advisors in the kingdom. But at the same time, jesters could never be given real political power or official positions because that would destroy the illusion of their harmless foolishness. They were simultaneously the most and least important people in the court, essential for the king's mental health, but expendable the moment they stopped being amusing. The honesty contradiction was perhaps the most mentally exhausting. Jesters were celebrated for being the only people who could tell the king the truth, but they could only tell that truth through lies, metaphors, and misdirection. They couldn't say, "Your Majesty, you're being an idiot and this policy will cause a rebellion." Instead, they had to say something like, "I had the strangest dream last night about a farmer who planted rocks instead of seeds and couldn't understand why his crops failed." The king was supposed to understand that he was the farmer, his policies were the rocks, and his kingdom was the failed crop. But he also had to pretend he thought it was just a silly dream story. Modern comedians deal with similar contradictions. They're expected to be funny, but not offensive, political, but not partisan, relatable, but not ordinary. But medieval jesters had to navigate these contradictions while literally balancing on a tightrope over a pit of very real consequences. They couldn't just get bad reviews or lose followers. They could lose their heads. Their families could lose their homes, and their deaths could be turned into public entertainment. The psychological pressure of maintaining these contradictions, day after day, year after year, while wearing ridiculous costumes and pretending everything was just fun and games, was enough to drive anyone insane. The result was a profession that produced some of the most psychologically complex and resilient people in medieval history, but also some of the most tragic casualties. Successful jesters developed almost supernatural abilities to read people, predict political outcomes, and diffuse dangerous situations. They became master manipulators, expert psychologists, and political strategists who could influence the course of history with a well-timed pratfall and a clever pun. But the unsuccessful ones, well, let's just say medieval courts didn't have unemployment benefits. Failed jesters didn't just lose their jobs. They often lost their lives, and sometimes their families paid the price too. There are records of jesters being executed for jokes that fell flat, for political observations that proved too accurate, or simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time when the king was having a particularly bad day. The psychological toll was immense. Many successful jesters developed what we might now recognize as severe anxiety disorders, depression, and what today we call PTSD. They lived in constant fear, never knowing if today's hilarious joke would be tomorrow's death sentence. Some turned to alcohol, others became genuinely mentally unstable, and a few simply disappeared from court life entirely, presumably deciding that poverty was preferable to the constant threat of execution. The nobles' reactions to jesters were equally complex. On one hand, they genuinely appreciated the entertainment and the psychological release that jesters provided. Court life was boring, stressful, and filled with political tension, so having someone around who could make everyone laugh was genuinely valuable. Many nobles developed real affection for their jesters, treating them almost like beloved pets. Which, when you think about it, is pretty insulting but was probably the best a jester could hope for. On the other hand, nobles were constantly aware that jesters knew too much. They'd witnessed private conversations, overheard secret plans, and observed personal weaknesses that could be politically damaging if they ever fell into the wrong hands. This created a love-hate relationship where nobles simultaneously depended on their jesters and feared them. It's like having a therapist who's also a potential blackmailer, except the therapist wears funny hats and practices juggling in your living room. The long-term consequences shaped the entire structure of medieval court life. Jesters became essential safety valves for political pressure, unofficial diplomats who could communicate messages that couldn't be said directly, and psychological support systems for rulers who had no other outlets for their stress and fears. They were, in many ways, the foundation that held the entire medieval political system together, one joke at a time. Meanwhile, while court jesters were perfecting the art of survival through comedy, a parallel world was developing in the streets and taverns of medieval towns. If court jesters were the elite special forces of medieval comedy, then the traveling performers, street entertainers, and tavern jesters were the regular army, less prestigious, less protected, but arguably more authentic and definitely more dangerous. These weren't polished court entertainers with steady jobs and royal protection. These were the comedy guerrillas, the underground resistance fighters of medieval humor, who had to make their living one crowd at a time, one joke at a time, without the safety net of royal favor or the luxury of knowing where their next meal was coming from. They dealt with drunken audiences, hostile city guards, religious authorities who considered entertainment sinful, and the constant threat of being accused of witchcraft if their jokes were too clever or their timing too perfect. While Will Sommers was carefully crafting political satire for Henry VIII's private amusement, there were hundreds of nameless jesters wandering the countryside, performing for peasants, merchants, and anyone else who could spare a coin for a laugh. Their stories were rarely recorded in official histories, but they were the ones who truly understood what it meant to live by comedy alone, without the protection of royal favor or the cushion of court life. Their world was raw, more honest, and infinitely more precarious than the gilded cage of court entertainment. If court jesters were the pampered house cats of medieval comedy, then traveling jesters were the street cats, scrappier, hungrier, and infinitely more resourceful. While Will Sommers was worrying about whether his jokes about Henry VIII's wives were politically appropriate, traveling jesters were worrying about whether their jokes about the local tax collector would get them run out of town, beaten up, or burned at the stake for heresy. The world of street entertainment was the Wild West of medieval comedy. No royal protection, no guaranteed meals, no fancy costumes provided by the royal wardrobe, just you, your wit, and whatever crowd you could gather before the city guards decided you were disturbing the peace. These performers had to be part comedian, part acrobat, part con artist, and part escape artist, because medieval audiences were not known for their patience with bad entertainment. Unlike the sophisticated political satire of court jesters, street performers dealt with immediate, visceral humor. They couldn't make subtle references to diplomatic situations or use clever metaphors about agricultural policy. Their audiences were farmers, blacksmiths, tavern workers, and merchants who worked 12-hour days and wanted to laugh at something they could understand immediately. You couldn't build up to a punchline over several minutes. You had about 30 seconds to prove you were worth their time before they wandered off to watch someone else get their hand chopped off for stealing bread. This environment created a completely different type of performer. Where court jesters were chess masters, street jesters were bare-knuckle boxers. They developed lightning-fast reflexes, razor-sharp timing, and an almost supernatural ability to read crowd dynamics. They had to be funnier, faster, and more memorable than every other form of entertainment available, which in medieval times included public executions, bear baiting, and watching people get tortured for various crimes. So yeah, the competition was pretty stiff. They weren't just competing with other comedians. They were competing with actual blood sports for audience attention. Consider the legendary Wat the Witty, a traveling jester who allegedly performed across England in the 1380s. Wat's specialty was what we might now call interactive comedy. He'd arrive in a town, set up in the market square, and immediately start incorporating local gossip, recent events, and audience members into his act. But here's where it gets interesting. It wasn't just entertaining people. He was essentially running a medieval intelligence network. His typical performance would start with him pretending to be a confused outsider who needed help understanding the town. "I've heard you have the most beautiful women in England," he'd announce, "but I must be in the wrong place because I only see farmers." The crowd would laugh and start shouting corrections, telling him about the baker's daughter or the merchant's wife. Within minutes, Wat would know who was married to whom, who was having affairs, who owed money to whom, and what the major scandals were. Then came the real artistry. Wat would weave all this information into improvised songs, skits, and jokes that had the audience rolling with laughter while simultaneously spreading gossip, settling scores, and sometimes even resolving disputes. One story tells of him arriving in a village where two families had been feuding over a property boundary for years. Through a series of increasingly ridiculous songs about chickens who couldn't figure out which yard they belonged in, Wat managed to make both families realize how stupid their fight looked to outsiders. By the end of the performance, they'd agreed to share the disputed land rather than continue looking like the idiots in Watt's chicken song. But Watt's greatest performance was also nearly his last. He arrived in a town during harvest time, when tensions were high because the local lord had demanded an extra tax to fund his participation in some distant war. The townspeople were angry, but afraid to openly resist. Watt's solution was to perform a historical ballad about a mythical king who taxed his people so heavily that they all turned into ghosts and haunted his castle until he couldn't sleep. The song was hilarious, with Watt doing different voices for each ghost and describing their various complaints in ridiculous detail. The crowd loved it. But the local lord's tax collector was in the audience and recognized the not-so-subtle criticism. As Watt was collecting coins from the laughing crowd, the tax collector stepped forward and accused him of sedition. This is where traveling jesters earned their reputation for quick thinking. Watt immediately fell to his knees and thanked the tax collector for pointing out his mistake. "You're absolutely right," he said. "That story is clearly about the terrible King of France, not our wonderful Lord." He then launched into an impromptu song about how the French king was so stupid he probably couldn't even spell tax, while the English lord was so wise he could count all his money without taking his shoes off. The crowd burst into laughter at this obvious insult disguised as a compliment. The tax collector couldn't figure out whether he'd been insulted or praised, and Watt used the confusion to pack up his props and disappear into the crowd. He was reportedly seen 3 towns over the next day, performing the same French king song with local variations. Another legendary performer was Margaret the Merry, one of the few female traveling jesters whose exploits were recorded. Margaret's specialty was what we'd now call crowd work. She'd pick audience members and create elaborate fictional backstories for them based on their appearance, clothing, and reactions. A nervous-looking merchant might become Sir Trembles-a-Lot, the bravest knight in England, who once defeated a dragon by boring it to death with stories about his shoe collection. Margaret's most famous performance was at a wedding where the bride and groom clearly didn't want to be married. It was obviously a political arrangement between families. Instead of ignoring the obvious tension, Margaret created an entire comedy routine about 2 chickens who were forced to share a coop but kept trying to build separate nests. She had the bride and groom laughing so hard at her chicken impressions that they forgot to be miserable about their arranged marriage. According to local legend, they actually fell in love during the performance and lived happily ever after, though that might be medieval spin doctoring to make the story more romantic. This wasn't isolated. Traveling jesters across medieval Europe developed remarkably similar techniques for survival and success. The pattern was always the same. Arrive in town as a harmless outsider, quickly gather intelligence about local issues and personalities, then create entertainment that simultaneously amused people and helped them process their problems, fears, and frustrations. What's fascinating is how these performers essentially invented modern stand-up comedy, improv theater, and social commentary, all at the same time, without any formal training or institutional support. They developed crowd control techniques that modern comedians still use: how to handle hecklers, how to read audience energy, how to recover from jokes that fall flat. They understood audience psychology in ways that wouldn't be formally studied until centuries later. The pattern existed because medieval society desperately needed these services. People lived in small, close communities where everyone knew everyone else's business, but there were no socially acceptable ways to discuss problems, mock authority figures, or release social tensions. Traveling jesters provided a temporary suspension of normal social rules, a brief period where it was safe to laugh at things that were usually forbidden topics. They also served as unofficial news networks in an era before mass communication. A jester who'd performed in 10 towns over the past month would know which lord was raising taxes, which merchant was cheating his customers, which priest was a little too friendly with the local women, and which villages were dealing with crop failures or disease outbreaks. They spread this information through humor, making it more memorable and more palatable than formal announcements. The economic pattern was equally consistent. Traveling jesters couldn't rely on steady employment like their court counterparts. So they developed what we'd now call the gig economy. They perform for tips, sell simple crafts or trinkets, sometimes work as messengers or informal marriage brokers, and occasionally get hired for private parties or special events. They were essentially medieval freelancers, constantly hustling to make ends meet. This created a natural selection process where only the most adaptable, creative, and psychologically resilient performers survived. Unlike court jesters, who could sometimes coast on royal favor, even if their material got stale, street performers had to prove themselves fresh every single day. They couldn't rely on familiar audiences who already knew their style. Every performance was essentially an audition for strangers who might throw coins or might throw rocks, depending on how entertaining they found the show. The social pattern was perhaps most important. Traveling jesters occupied a unique position as outsiders who were temporarily welcomed into communities. They could say things locals couldn't say, ask questions locals couldn't ask, and observe social dynamics that locals were too close to see clearly. The effects were far-reaching and often unexpected. While court jesters influenced political decisions that affected kingdoms, traveling jesters influenced social attitudes that affected entire cultures. They were the people who decided what was funny, what was acceptable to mock, and how ordinary people should think about authority, relationships, and social problems. Who benefited most were undoubtedly the common people who finally had someone speaking their language and addressing their concerns. For the first time in medieval history, there were professional entertainers whose entire job was making ordinary people laugh, rather than impressing nobles or religious authorities. Traveling jesters gave voice to frustrations that peasants and merchants could never express directly. They could laugh at the tax collector's greed, the priest's hypocrisy, and the lord's stupidity without being accused of sedition or heresy. Women particularly benefited from female traveling performers like Margaret the Mary, who provided rare examples of women speaking publicly, earning their own money, and wielding social influence through humor. In a society where women were expected to be silent and submissive, female jesters demonstrated that wit and intelligence could be more powerful than conventional authority, but the lords and religious authorities suffered the most from this new form of social commentary. Traveling jesters made it impossible for corrupt officials to maintain their dignity or authority. A tax collector who'd been made the subject of a popular comic song would find his authority undermined in every town where that song was known. Priests who'd been mocked for their hypocrisy would discover that their sermons were met with barely suppressed laughter from congregations who remembered the jester's parody. The unintended consequences were enormous. By making it socially acceptable to mock authority figures, traveling jesters helped plant the seeds of social movements that wouldn't fully bloom for centuries. They normalized the idea that ordinary people could judge their leaders, that authority had to be earned rather than simply demanded, and that humor could be a form of resistance. Perhaps most importantly, they helped create what we'd now call popular culture, entertainment created by and for ordinary people rather than elites. Before traveling jesters, most entertainment was either religious, designed to teach moral lessons, or aristocratic, designed to impress other nobles. Traveling jesters created the first truly democratic form of entertainment, where success was determined by popular appeal rather than official approval. The long-term impact on European culture was immense. The traditions established by medieval traveling performers eventually evolved into commedia dell'arte, Shakespearean comedy, music hall entertainment, vaudeville, and ultimately modern stand-up comedy and improv theater. Every time you watch a comedian work a crowd, handle a heckler, or turn a current event into a punchline, you're watching techniques that were perfected by medieval street performers who learned their craft while dodging rocks and tax collectors. Yet even as traveling jesters were revolutionizing popular entertainment and social commentary, the most dramatic stories were unfolding back in the royal courts, where the stakes were higher, the audiences more dangerous, and the consequences more permanent. The comfortable world of court entertainment was about to face its greatest test, as the political tensions that jesters have been helping to manage through humor finally reached a breaking point by the late medieval period. The relationship between jesters and royalty had evolved into something far more complex and dangerous than simple entertainment. Kings had become dependent on their jesters, not just for laughs, but for psychological support, political advice, and emotional stability. At the same time, jesters had accumulated unprecedented power and influence, making them targets for ambitious nobles, suspicious queens, and paranoid monarchs who began to wonder if their trusted comedians knew too much for their own good. The stage was set for confrontations that would make or break careers, reshape kingdoms, and sometimes end in spectacular violence. What happened when a jester's joke went too far? When a king's paranoia overcame his sense of humor? When the delicate balance between truth and entertainment finally collapsed under the weight of political pressure? The answers to these questions would determine not just the fate of individual performers, but the future of an entire profession that had become essential to the functioning of medieval society. The golden age of court jesters was about to face its ultimate test. By 1538, the court of Henry VIII had become a psychological powder keg, with Will Sommers holding the only lit match. The king who'd once laughed at jokes about his weight was now a paranoid, increasingly unstable monarch who'd already executed 2 wives, countless nobles, and anyone else who looked at him sideways. The court had transformed from a place of political maneuvering into something resembling a medieval horror movie, where the monster wore a crown and had absolute power over life and death. The tension had been building for months. Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves was already falling apart before the honeymoon ended. Apparently, calling your new wife a Flanders Mar isn't great for marital bliss. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister and the man who'd arranged the marriage, was desperately trying to salvage the situation, while knowing that failure meant his head would soon be decorating London Bridge. The court was divided into factions, each plotting against the others, and everyone was walking on eggshells around a king whose mood swings had become legendary. Into this atmosphere of barely controlled chaos stepped Will Sommers, still trying to do his job of keeping the king entertained and psychologically stable. But Henry was no longer the relatively jovial tyrant who'd laughed at jokes about his previous wives. He'd become genuinely paranoid, seeing conspiracies everywhere, trusting no one completely, and increasingly convinced that even his closest advisors were plotting against him. The breaking point came during what should have been a routine court entertainment session. Henry had summoned Will to his private chambers, which usually meant the king wanted to vent his frustrations through humor before making important decisions. But this time was different. Henry was pacing like a caged animal, muttering about traitors and conspiracies, and he kept glancing at Will with an expression that the jester had never seen before. Genuine suspicion mixed with barely controlled rage. For the first time in his career, Will Sommers realized he might be in real danger, not from a poorly timed joke, but simply from being in the wrong place when the king's paranoia finally exploded. The confrontation began innocuously enough. Henry demanded that Will perform his usual routine of political commentary disguised as harmless entertainment. "Tell me something amusing about my court," the king commanded, but his tone suggested this was more of a test than a request. Will, reading the dangerous mood, decided to play it safe with some gentle observations about the weather and the upcoming harvest. Boring, harmless material that couldn't possibly offend anyone. But Henry wasn't having it. "Come now, Will," the king said, his voice taking on that particular edge that court veterans had learned to fear. "Surely you have something more illuminating to share. You seem to know everything that happens in my court. Perhaps you know things that even I don't know?" This was dangerous territory. Will realized that Henry wasn't looking for entertainment. He was fishing for information, testing Will's loyalty, and possibly setting him up for accusations of espionage. The jester's mind raced through his options. He could claim ignorance, but Henry knew Will was too observant to be genuinely clueless. He could deflect with self-deprecating humor, but the king seemed beyond the reach of simple distraction techniques. Will chose the most dangerous option. He decided to tell the truth, but wrap it in such obvious comedy that Henry couldn't accuse him of serious political commentary. "Your Majesty," Will said, adopting his most ridiculous voice, "I have indeed observed something fascinating about your court. It appears that everyone is so terrified of displeasing you that they've all developed the same facial expression. It's like someone replaced your entire nobility with a collection of particularly nervous sheep." For a moment, the room was silent. Will could hear his own heartbeat, and was fairly certain it might be the last sound he'd ever hear. Henry's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, consideration, and then something that might have been amusement or might have been the prelude to homicidal rage. Then Henry did something completely unexpected. He burst out laughing, but it wasn't his usual hearty chuckle. This was a high-pitched, slightly hysterical laugh that sent chills down Will's spine. "Sheep," Henry repeated, wiping tears from his eyes. "Nervous sheep. Oh, well, you have no idea how accurate that is. But tell me, my observant fool, what does that make me? The shepherd? Or perhaps ... single quotes, his voice dropped to a whisper, the wolf?" Now Will was truly in uncharted territory. Henry was essentially asking him to psychoanalyze the king's relationship with his subjects, disguised as a continuation of the sheep metaphor. One wrong word could be interpreted as criticism of royal authority, sedition, or even treason. But Will had come too far to back down now. "Your Majesty," Will said carefully, "if they are sheep and you are the shepherd, then you are the loneliest man in England. Because shepherds protect their flocks, but they can never be part of them. They watch from the outside, always alert for wolves, never able to simply graze peacefully with the others. It must be ... single quotes." He paused, choosing his words with surgical precision, a very heavy responsibility. The silence that followed seemed to last forever. Henry stopped pacing and stared at Will with an intensity that made the jester wonder if he'd just signed his own death warrant. Then, without warning, Henry's face crumpled, and for a brief moment, the most powerful man in England looked like a lost child. "Lonely," Henry whispered, and Will realized that in trying to save himself, he'd accidentally touched something raw and real in the king's psyche. "Yes, Will, lonely is exactly right. Do you know what it's like to never trust anyone? To wonder if every smile hides a dagger? To know that your closest advisors would sell you to your enemies for the right price?" This was completely unprecedented. Henry was essentially having a therapy session with his jester, dropping the royal facade and speaking like a human being, instead of a monarch. Will knew he was witnessing something that could never be repeated or acknowledged, and one misstep could still prove fatal. "Your Majesty," Will said gently, abandoning his usual comic persona entirely. "Perhaps the sheep are nervous not because they fear the shepherd, but because they love him and want to please him. Sometimes fear and love look very similar from the outside. And sometimes, single quotes, he took a breath and committed to the most dangerous sentence of his career. Sometimes the shepherd is just as afraid of the wolves as the sheep are. Henry stared at him for what felt like an eternity, and Will could practically see the king's mind processing this unprecedented moment of genuine human connection. Would Henry appreciate the honesty? Or would he be enraged that his jester had dared to treat him like an ordinary person with ordinary fears and insecurities? The response was unlike anything in the recorded history of royal jester interactions. Instead of exploding in rage or rewarding Will with gold, Henry simply sat down heavily in his chair and put his head in his hands. For several minutes, the King of England sat in silence while his jester waited to discover whether he just saved his career or ended his life. When Henry finally looked up, his eyes were red, but his voice was steady. "Well," he said quietly, "you are either the wisest man in my kingdom or the most dangerous. I haven't decided which." Then, after another pause that seemed to last forever, he added, "Perhaps you're both." The immediate consequence was that Will Sommers became the only person in Henry's court who was allowed to speak to the king as a human being rather than a royal institution. But this privilege came with a terrible price. Will now carried the burden of Henry's psychological well-being. The king began summoning him not for entertainment, but for what we'd now recognize as informal therapy sessions. Will found himself listening to Henry's fears about death, his regrets about his wives, his paranoia about foreign threats, and his deep, crushing loneliness that the political fallout was enormous. Other courtiers began to view Will with a mixture of envy and terror, recognizing that he'd achieved unprecedented access to the king's mind, but also knowing that such access made him incredibly dangerous to cross. Thomas Cromwell, still desperately trying to manage the Anne of Cleves situation, began courting Will's favor, hoping the jester could influence Henry's mood in his favor. But the psychological consequences for Will were devastating. He'd essentially become Henry's unpaid, unqualified psychiatrist, dealing with problems that would challenge modern mental health professionals. The stress of managing a paranoid monarch's emotional state while maintaining his cover as a harmless entertainer began taking a visible toll. Court observers noted that Will's performances became more subdued, his usual wit tempered by an underlying tension that hadn't been there before. The broader court atmosphere changed dramatically. Word spread that the king had shown vulnerability to his jester, which paradoxically made Henry both more human and more dangerous. Nobles who'd previously dismissed Will as harmless entertainment now realized he wielded unprecedented influence, while those who'd seen him as a potential ally now feared that crossing him might mean facing royal wrath. Most significantly, the incident established a new precedent for royal jester relationships across Europe. Other courts began to recognize that jesters could serve as informal royal counselors, leading to a brief period where the profession gained political influence. That would have been unthinkable in earlier eras. But it also made the job infinitely more dangerous, as jesters found themselves caught between their traditional role as entertainers and their new function as royal confidants. This confrontation wasn't just about one king and one jester having an emotional breakthrough. It revealed the fundamental instability at the heart of absolute monarchy. Henry's breakdown exposed the psychological cost of wielding unlimited power in a system with no checks, balances, or support structures for rulers' mental health. What Will had accidentally discovered was that medieval kings were just as susceptible to anxiety, depression, and paranoia as anyone else, but they were trapped in roles that made it impossible to seek help or acknowledge weakness. The royal persona demanded constant displays of strength, wisdom, and divine authority, while the human reality involved fear, uncertainty, and emotional vulnerability. Jesters had inadvertently become the only outlet for the suppressed human The incident also demonstrated how comedy could function as a form of primitive psychotherapy. Will's use of metaphor, gentle truth-telling, and emotional validation provided Henry with something that no amount of royal power could purchase: genuine human connection. But it also showed the dangers of amateur psychology when the patient has the power to execute the therapist for making mistakes. From a broader historical perspective, this confrontation marked the beginning of the end for the traditional court. Jester system. Once jesters became informal royal counselors, they lost the protective shield of harmless entertainment that had allowed them to operate safely. They gained political influence, but sacrificed the plausible deniability that had kept them alive. The psychological dynamics revealed in Henry's chamber would be repeated in courts across Europe as other monarchs discovered that their jesters could provide emotional support that was unavailable elsewhere. But each of these relationships carried the same inherent instability. The moment a jester's psychological insights became inconvenient or threatening, their traditional role as disposable entertainment made them easy targets for royal displeasure. Most tragically, the incident revealed how desperately medieval society needed mental health resources that simply didn't exist. Kings, nobles, and commoners alike suffered from psychological problems that had no formal treatment options, creating a situation where court jesters essentially became the medieval equivalent of therapists, social workers, and counselors. Except they had no training, no professional protections, and no retirement plans beyond hoping their royal patients didn't have them executed for knowing too much about their emotional problems. Around Will Sommers and his psychological warfare with Henry VIII, a colorful cast of other professional comedians were playing equally dangerous games with their own royal employers. Each developed their own survival strategies, and their stories reveal just how varied this profession could be. From brilliant manipulators to tragic casualties to absolute madmen who somehow thrived in the chaos of medieval courts. Meet Tribolet, the hunchback jester of French King Louis XII and later Francis I, who inspired Victor Hugo's character in The Man Who Laughs and eventually Verdi's opera Rigoletto. Unlike Will Sommers' psychological approach, Tribolet was a master of physical comedy and political satire who used his disability as both a shield and a weapon. His deformed appearance made him appear harmless and pitiable, which allowed him to deliver devastating political commentary that would have gotten a normal-looking person executed immediately. Tribolet understood that people's discomfort with his appearance made them less likely to take his words seriously as threats, even when he was essentially describing exactly how corrupt and incompetent the French court had become. Tribolet's specialty was what we'd now call roasting. He'd pick a target, usually a pompous noble or corrupt official, and systematically destroy their reputation through a series of increasingly elaborate jokes and pranks. One famous story describes how he convinced the court that a particularly arrogant duke was actually illiterate by challenging him to a reading contest, where all the books were written in Latin, knowing the duke had lied about his education. When the duke tried to fake his way through reading Virgil, Tribolet helpfully corrected his pronunciation so many times that everyone realized the duke couldn't actually read the words. The duke's political influence never recovered from being publicly exposed as an educated fraud by a hunchback jester. Then there was Yorick. Yes, that Yorick, the one from Hamlet, who was a real historical figure before Shakespeare immortalized him as a skull. The actual Yorick served at the Danish court and was famous for his incredibly dark sense of humor and his complete fearlessness in the face of royal displeasure. While other jesters tried to soften their criticism with gentle humor, Yorick specialized in what we'd now call shock comedy. He'd make jokes about death, disease, political corruption, and royal incompetence that were so blunt and horrifying that audiences didn't know whether to laugh or run for cover. Yorick's most famous Performance was during a court feast where several nobles were bragging about their military victories and heroic deeds. Yorick listened to their increasingly exaggerated stories for about an hour, then stood up and announced that he'd like to tell a story about the bravest man he'd ever met. The court fell silent, expecting another tale of military glory. Instead, Yorick launched into a detailed description of a gravedigger he'd known who was so brave that he willingly spent every day surrounded by corpses, never knowing if today's dead body might carry the plague that would kill him tomorrow. That man, Yorick concluded, faces death every day for a few coins, while you brave heroes face it once or twice for glory, and then spend the rest of your lives bragging about it. Who's really braver? The nobles were so stunned by this comparison that they couldn't figure out whether they'd been complimented or insulted, which was exactly Yorick's intention. He'd managed to simultaneously mock their cowardice and their vanity while appearing to praise a humble working man, all without technically insulting anyone directly. It was psychological warfare disguised as storytelling, and it established Yorick's reputation as the most unpredictably dangerous jester in Europe. Perhaps most fascinating was Buffon, the anonymous jester of the French court whose real name was never recorded, but whose influence shaped royal policy for decades. Buffon's strategy was the exact opposite of his colleagues. Instead of standing out, he made himself completely forgettable. He was average height, average appearance, spoke in an average voice, and told seemingly average jokes. But this unremarkable exterior hid one of the most sophisticated political minds in medieval Europe, because no one remembered him as an individual. Buffon could move through court gatherings like an invisible observer, gathering intelligence and spreading information without anyone realizing he was doing it. These weren't isolated incidents. The jester community formed a surprisingly sophisticated network of professional comedians who shared information, techniques, and sometimes even coordinated their efforts across different courts. When Tribalette discovered a particularly effective way to mock corrupt tax collectors, word would somehow reach Yorick in Denmark, who would adapt the technique for his own political situations. When Will Sommers developed a new method for managing royal paranoia, other English jesters would mysteriously begin using similar approaches. This network operated through traveling performers who carried messages between courts, nobles who gossiped about entertaining acts they'd witnessed elsewhere, and surprisingly, through monks and priests who appreciated clever wordplay and often served as unofficial communication channels between different kingdoms. The result was a kind of medieval comedy underground where professional entertainers could learn from each other's successes and failures without formal training, institutions, or guilds. The most dramatic example of this interconnection was the Great Jester Conspiracy of 1456, which wasn't actually a conspiracy, but looked like one to paranoid royal authorities. It started when several jesters across different European courts began telling remarkably similar jokes about a mythical king who was so stupid he tried to tax the air his subjects breathed. The jokes were funny, but they also contained sophisticated economic commentary about how excessive taxation was strangling commerce and innovation. What royal authorities didn't realize was that these jokes weren't coordinated political propaganda. They were just good material spreading through the professional entertainment network. One jester had developed a clever way to criticize tax policy. Other jesters had heard about it and adapted it for their own courts. And the result was simultaneous criticism of royal economic policies across multiple kingdoms. To paranoid monarchs, this looked like evidence of an international conspiracy of jesters working together to undermine royal authority. The panic that followed was both tragic and hilarious. Several jesters were arrested and interrogated about their involvement in this supposed conspiracy. leading to the bizarre spectacle of professional comedians being tortured for information about joke-sharing networks. The investigation revealed the actual scope of jester communication, which authorities found almost more disturbing than a real conspiracy would have been. The idea that entertainers were independently developing sophisticated political criticism and sharing it across international boundaries suggested a level of intellectual coordination that made rulers very nervous. The relationships between jesters were also intensely competitive. Tribalette and a rival jester named Khaled engaged in what can only be described as a medieval comedy feud that lasted for years and involved increasingly elaborate attempts to upstage each other. Their rivalry began over a disputed joke attribution. Both claimed to have invented a particular satirical song about corrupt church officials, and escalated into a series of public comedy duels where they tried to destroy each other's reputations. Through humor, one famous confrontation occurred at a diplomatic gathering where both courts were present. Tribalette performed a song mocking Khaled's appearance, intelligence, and comedic abilities. Khaled responded by performing an elaborate mime routine that portrayed Tribalette as a monkey trying to impress humans by imitating their behavior. Tribalette's counterattack was a mock funeral service for Khaled's career, complete with a eulogy listing all the jokes that had died from poor delivery. The audience was torn between horror and amusement as two professional entertainers essentially tried to murder each other's careers in real time. The feud only ended when both jesters realized they were inadvertently entertaining their audiences more through their rivalry than either had managed individually. They formed an unlikely partnership, developing a comedy routine based on their mutual hatred that became one of the most popular entertainment acts in medieval Europe. Their fake animosity was so convincing that audiences never realized the two men had become genuine friends who were simply performing exaggerated versions of their former rivalry. These interconnected relationships created a shadow network of influence that operated parallel to official diplomatic channels. Jesters who served different monarchs would exchange information about royal moods, political tensions, and potential conflicts, creating an informal early warning system that sometimes prevented wars and sometimes accidentally started them when miscommunication led to diplomatic misunderstandings. To understand these jesters and their relationships, you have to understand that medieval court life was essentially a never-ending psychological experiment in group dynamics, power structures, and social control. Daily life in a royal court was like living in a reality TV show where the cameras never stopped rolling. The stakes were life and death, and the producers had absolute power over the contestants. Nobles woke up each morning knowing that their social status, political influence, and physical safety depended on maintaining the favor of one incredibly powerful, often unstable person who might change his mind about anything at any moment. They had to compete constantly for attention, resources, and approval while pretending to be loyal friends and supporters. The psychological pressure was enormous, and there were virtually no healthy outlets for stress, frustration, or honest communication. Beliefs and attitudes were shaped by a worldview that saw hierarchy as divinely ordained and questioning authority as literally sinful. At the same time, everyone could see that many authority figures were incompetent, corrupt, or insane, creating a cognitive dissonance that had no acceptable resolution. People were supposed to respect and obey leaders they knew were destroying their lives, and they had no legitimate way to express their frustration or work for change. Social structures were incredibly rigid, with your birth determining your opportunities, your clothing, your housing, your legal rights, and essentially every aspect of your life. Social mobility was rare and usually required either extraordinary luck, exceptional talent, or willingness to engage in dangerous political maneuvering. Most people were trapped in whatever social position they'd inherited, watching incompetent, Nobles make decisions that affected their lives while being legally prohibited from criticism or resistance. What was normal in this environment would seem absolutely insane to modern people. It was normal for kings to execute people for minor offenses, normal for nobles to settle disputes through trial by combat, normal for religious authorities to burn people alive for having unauthorized opinions about theology. It was normal to live in constant fear of violence, disease, and starvation, while watching wealthy people waste resources on elaborate displays of luxury and power. What was exceptional was any form of honest communication, genuine emotional expression, or acknowledgement that the system might have problems. Jesters were exceptional because they provided the only socially acceptable outlet for people to laugh at their problems, mock their oppressors, and imagine alternatives to their current situation. They were pressure valves in a system that would have exploded from internal contradictions without some way to release tension. In this context, the relationships between jesters and their audiences take on much deeper significance. They weren't just providing entertainment. They were providing psychological survival tools for people trapped in an inherently traumatic social system. The jester's ability to make people laugh at their suffering wasn't cruel. It was one of the few ways people could maintain their sanity while living through circumstances that would drive most modern people to complete psychological breakdown. Perhaps most ironic was that the people responsible for maintaining royal dignity and authority were also the people systematically undermining it through humor. Jesters were paid by the same monarchs they spent their careers mocking, protected by the same system they constantly criticized, and celebrated by the same nobles whose incompetence they regularly exposed. It's like hiring a professional roaster to be your personal therapist. Technically, they're helping you, but they're also destroying your self-esteem for entertainment value. The contradiction of their social status was equally absurd. Jesters were simultaneously the most and least important people in court. They had unprecedented access to royal private lives, but no official political power. They could influence major policy decisions through humor, but couldn't officially participate in government. They were trusted with state secrets, but excluded from formal decision-making processes. They were essential for royal psychological health, but could be executed at any moment for doing their jobs too well. Modern parallels to these contradictions are everywhere in contemporary entertainment and politics. Late-night comedians have enormous influence on public opinion, but no official political role. Social media influencers can shape cultural attitudes, but have no formal authority. Political satirists can destroy careers through humor, but aren't considered legitimate political participants. The same tensions that medieval jesters navigated still exist. We've just replaced executioners, axes with cancel culture, and social media pylons. Perhaps the most profound contradiction was that jesters achieved immortality through their disposability, because they were considered expendable entertainment rather than important historical figures. Their names and stories were often lost to history, but their influence on culture, politics, and social attitudes was so significant that we're still dealing with the consequences centuries later. They shaped how we think about authority, humor, and the relationship between entertainment and political power, but most of them died in poverty and obscurity. The ultimate irony is that by pretending to be fools, jesters became some of the wisest people in medieval society. By accepting the role of harmless entertainers, they gained power that traditional political figures could never achieve. By embracing their status as social outcasts, they became essential to the functioning of the very system that marginalized them. They discovered that in a world where direct power was dangerous, indirect influence through humor could be more effective than any amount of official authority. Everything changed when printing presses started churning out books faster than jesters could memorize jokes. Around 1450, Johannes Gutenberg's invention didn't just revolutionize how information spread. it accidentally began the death sentence for traditional court jesters. Suddenly, entertainment didn't have to be live, personal, and risky. Kings could read satirical pamphlets in private. Nobles could enjoy written comedies without worrying about political implications. And most devastatingly for our jester friends, people could laugh at authority figures without needing someone brave enough to make jokes in person. The printing revolution created the first mass media, and like every subsequent technological advancement, it made certain jobs obsolete overnight. Why risk your life hiring a jester who might accidentally insult you when you could read professionally written satire that was guaranteed to mock your enemies instead of you? It's like how streaming services kill video rental stores, except in this case, the video store clerks occasionally got executed for recommending the wrong movie. But the real game changer wasn't just the technology. It was what the technology enabled. For the first time in history, ideas could spread faster than royal authorities could control them. A satirical pamphlet written in London could be reprinted in Paris, Rome, and Vienna before the original author could be identified and executed. This created a new type of entertainment that was both more democratic and more dangerous than anything jesters had achieved. The shift wasn't immediate. It took about a century for the full implications to become clear. During the transitional period, some jesters tried to adapt by incorporating printed material into their acts, essentially becoming medieval stand-up comedians who updated their routines based on the latest satirical publications. Others attempted to stay relevant by specializing in improvisational humor that couldn't be replicated in print. A few particularly entrepreneurial jesters even tried to become writers themselves, but most discovered that the skills required for surviving royal court politics didn't necessarily translate to successful publishing careers. The psychological impact on rulers was profound. Kings who'd grown dependent on their jesters for emotional support and political advice suddenly found themselves with new options for entertainment and commentary. They could consume humorous content without the interpersonal drama, without worrying about whether their jester was secretly plotting against them, and without the constant stress of managing someone who knew all their personal secrets. At the same time, the democratization of satirical content meant that royal authority was being mocked by hundreds of anonymous writers rather than one identifiable court employee. This was both better and worse for monarchs. Better because they couldn't be personally insulted by writers they'd never met. Worse because they couldn't control the narrative by simply executing or threatening their jester. The age of personalized royal entertainment was ending, and the age of mass media criticism was beginning. The transformation unfolded like a very slow, very polite revolution where everyone pretended nothing was happening while everything changed completely. The first phase involved jesters desperately trying to prove they were still relevant in a world that was rapidly making them obsolete. Some attempted to become more literary, memorizing and performing written comedies instead of relying on improvisation. Others went in the opposite direction, emphasizing physical comedy and acrobatic skills that couldn't be replicated on paper. Will Sommers, ever the survivor, tried to adapt by positioning himself as Henry VIII's personal literary critic. He'd read new publications and provide commentary for the king, essentially becoming a medieval book reviewer with the added responsibility of making sure none of the content would trigger Henry's legendary temper. This worked for a while, but it also highlighted how the jester's role was fundamentally changing from creator to curator of entertainment. That resistance to change came from predictable sources. Traditional nobles, who'd grown up with personal jesters, saw the shift toward printed entertainment as another sign that society was becoming impersonal and democratic in disturbing ways. They preferred the exclusivity and personal attention that came with having their own dedicated comedian, even if that comedian occasionally insulted them to their faces. It was like preferring a personal chef to restaurant dining. More expensive, more complicated, but undeniably more prestigious. The church initially opposed both printing presses and jesters with equal enthusiasm, viewing both as threats to their monopoly on moral instruction and social commentary. Religious authorities had never been comfortable with jesters' tendency to mock everyone equally, including priests and bishops, but they were even less comfortable with printed, satirical pamphlets that could spread heretical ideas faster than they could be suppressed. This put jesters in the strange position of being allies with their former ecclesiastical enemies against the common threat of mass-produced entertainment. Champions of change included, surprisingly, many jesters themselves. The younger generation of performers realized that adapting to new technology was preferable to unemployment, exile, or execution. They began collaborating with printers, contributing material to satirical publications, and essentially becoming the first freelance comedy writers in history. Instead of being exclusively employed by one royal court, they could sell jokes and stories to multiple publishers, creating the prototype for modern entertainment industry careers. The breakthrough moments were often accidental. One pivotal incident occurred when a collection of jokes allegedly told by Sommers was published without his knowledge or permission. The book became incredibly popular, but it also demonstrated that jester humor could be commodified and mass-produced without the jester's direct participation. Will's jokes were being performed by other entertainers across Europe, but he wasn't receiving any compensation or credit. This highlighted both the potential and the problems of the new entertainment economy. Another crucial development was the emergence of commedia dell'arte in Italy around 1550. These traveling theater troupes essentially took the improvisational skills that jesters had developed and turned them into a more structured, repeatable form of entertainment. Instead of one jester serving one court, a troupe of performers could entertain multiple audiences with standardized characters and scenarios. It was like the difference between custom-made clothing and ready-to-wear fashion, less personalized, but more accessible and economically viable. The role of individuals versus larger historical forces in this transformation is fascinating. Visionary jesters like Tribalette tried to create new forms of entertainment that combined traditional jester skills with printed material, essentially inventing early versions of multimedia performance art. But their individual innovations were less important than the broader economic and technological forces that were reshaping all forms of entertainment. The printing press created a market for written humor that hadn't existed before, which created economic opportunities for writers that competed with traditional jester employment. The growth of urban centers created larger audiences for traveling entertainers, making it possible to earn a living through multiple small performances rather than one exclusive royal contract. The increasing literacy rates among merchants and artisans created demand for printed entertainment that went far beyond what royal courts could provide. Most significantly, the Protestant Reformation challenged the idea that authority figures deserved automatic respect and obedience. When religious rebels were publicly questioning the Pope's authority and translating sacred texts into common languages, it became much harder to maintain that secular rulers were beyond criticism. The intellectual revolution that made religious reform possible also made it socially acceptable to mock political authorities in ways that would have been unthinkable a century earlier. The new entertainment landscape was simultaneously more free and more constrained than the old jester system. Professional entertainers had more creative freedom because they weren't dependent on the mood swings of individual monarchs. But they also had less job security because they were competing in an open market rather than holding exclusive royal contracts. The most successful survivors of this transition were those who understood that the future belonged to content creators rather than court employees. Instead of serving one master, they learned to serve multiple audiences. Instead of personalizing their humor for specific royal neuroses, they developed material that could appeal to broader social concerns. Instead of relying on their personal relationship with a monarch for protection, they learned to use anonymity and geographic mobility as shields against political persecution. The new system created opportunities that hadn't existed before. For the first time, talented performers from humble backgrounds could achieve fame and influence without needing royal patronage. Written humor could reach audiences that traveling performers could never access, people in remote villages, foreign countries, or social classes that were traditionally excluded from court entertainment. The democratization of comedy meant that satirical content was no longer limited to the political concerns of the ruling class. But the changes also created new problems. The personal relationship between jester and ruler had provided a certain level of mutual understanding and protection that disappeared in the mass media model. When entertainment became a commodity rather than a service, the human connections that had made the jester system work were lost. Kings could no longer threaten their critics directly, but they also couldn't negotiate with them or understand their motivations. The quality of satirical content became more uneven. Court jesters had been, by necessity, extremely skilled performers who'd survived rigorous natural selection processes. Not everyone could handle the psychological pressure of entertaining paranoid monarchs, so only the most talented and resilient performers lasted long enough to become famous. The printing press allowed less skilled writers to reach large audiences, leading to an explosion of mediocre satirical content alongside genuine innovations in comedic writing. Social dynamics changed dramatically. The old system had created intimate relationships between entertainers and their audiences, allowing for sophisticated psychological manipulation and genuine emotional connections. The new system created distant relationships between content creators and consumers, making entertainment less personal but more scalable. It was the difference between having a personal trainer and following workout videos. Both could be effective, but the experience was fundamentally different. The political implications were enormous. Under the old system, royal authorities could control satirical content by managing their jesters directly. Under the new system, they had to deal with dozens of anonymous writers, underground printing operations, and international distribution networks that were virtually impossible to police effectively. This forced governments to develop new strategies for managing public opinion, leading to the early development of what we now call propaganda and media manipulation. Most importantly, the new reality established patterns that would define entertainment industry economics for the next 5 centuries. The tension between artistic freedom and commercial viability. The challenge of creating content that appeals to mass audiences without losing individual voice. The difficulty of maintaining creative integrity while satisfying market demands. All of these modern entertainment industry problems were first encountered by former court jesters trying to adapt to the printing press revolution. Was this change ultimately positive or negative for comedy, society, and the entertainers themselves? The answer depends entirely on your perspective and priorities, which is probably exactly what you'd expect from a historical transition that nobody really planned or controlled. From the perspective of creative freedom, the printing press revolution was unquestionably positive. Entertainers were no longer constrained by the personal preferences, political paranoia, or homicidal tendencies of individual monarchs. They could write about topics that interested them, develop their own comedic voices, and build audiences based on merit rather than royal favor. The democratization of humor meant that satirical content could address the concerns of ordinary people rather than focusing exclusively on court politics and noble drama. From an economic standpoint, the results were mixed. A few entertainers achieved unprecedented success by adapting to the new system, earning more money and reaching larger audiences than any court jester could have imagined. But many more found themselves struggling in an increasingly competitive market where success required not just comedic talent, but also business skills, marketing savvy, and the ability to navigate complex publishing relationships. From a social perspective, the change was revolutionary. The old jester system had reinforced social hierarchies by making entertainment dependent on royal approval and noble patronage. The new system made it possible for comedic content to challenge authority structures rather than simply providing pressure relief valves for them. Satirical pamphlets could spread ideas about social equality, political reform, and individual rights that would have been impossible to express safely under the old system. But the personal costs were significant. The old system, for all its dangers, had provided genuine human connections between entertainers and their audiences. Jesters knew their monarchs intimately, understood their psychological needs, and could provide personalized entertainment that addressed specific individual concerns. The new system created more distant relationships that were less emotionally satisfying for both creators and consumers. The long-term effects on political stability are still debated by historians. Some argue that the transition from personalized court entertainment to mass media commentary helped stabilize governments by making criticism less personal and threatening. Others contend that the democratization of satirical content contributed to political instability by making it easier for revolutionary ideas to spread beyond the control of traditional authorities. In the years following the printing press revolution, the entertainment landscape transformed into something that would have been completely unrecognizable to Will Sommers and his medieval colleagues. By 1600, the idea of having a personal jester seemed as antiquated as having a personal dragon or a personal plague doctor. Theoretically possible, but impractical and slightly embarrassing for anyone trying to appear sophisticated and modern. The former court jesters who'd successfully adapted to the new reality found themselves pioneers in what we'd now recognize as the modern entertainment industry. Instead of serving individual monarchs, they were creating content for theaters, publishing houses, and traveling performance companies. Instead of personalizing their humor for specific royal neuroses, they were developing characters and scenarios that could work for diverse audiences across different social classes and geographic regions. But the transition wasn't smooth, and the casualties were significant. Many traditional jesters simply couldn't adapt to working without the personal relationships and royal protection that had defined their careers. They'd spent decades learning to read individual monarchs' moods, preferences, and psychological trigger points, skills that were essentially useless in a mass entertainment market where success depended on appealing to hundreds of strangers. Simultaneously, new challenges emerged that medieval jesters had never faced. Instead of worrying about whether their jokes would anger one temperamental king, performers now had to consider whether their material would offend religious authorities, government censors, local magistrates, guild leaders, or any of dozens of other power centers that could shut down their careers. The old system had been dangerous but simple. Displease the king, lose your head. The new system was safer but infinitely more complex. Displease the wrong combination of influential people, and you might find yourself banned from performing, excluded from publishing opportunities, or facing criminal charges for sedition, heresy, or public disorder. The economics of entertainment became both more democratic and more precarious. Under the old system, a successful jester could count on steady employment, regular meals, and royal protection for as long as they remained in favor. Under the new system, entertainers had to constantly hustle for work, manage their own finances, and build audiences without institutional support. It was like the difference between being a tenured professor and being a freelance consultant. More freedom, but also more uncertainty and stress. The psychological impact on performers was enormous. Medieval jesters had developed their skills in environments where failure meant death, creating incredibly resilient and adaptable entertainers who could handle any form of pressure or criticism. Renaissance-era performers faced different pressures that were often more psychologically challenging than physical danger. Instead of one clear enemy, royal displeasure, they faced multiple, shifting sources of criticism and judgment. Instead of immediate, dramatic consequences for failure, they faced gradual career decline that could be harder to recognize and respond to effectively. The Renaissance brought an entirely new cast of characters to the entertainment world, and their approaches to comedy and performance would have seemed revolutionary to medieval jesters. These weren't desperate survivors trying to avoid execution. They were artists, entrepreneurs, and social commentators who saw entertainment as a legitimate profession worthy of respect and artistic development. Enter William Shakespeare, who essentially took everything court jesters had been doing informally and turned it into high art. Shakespeare understood that the jester's traditional role, speaking truth through humor, providing social commentary disguised as entertainment, and offering psychological insights wrapped in comedic performances, could be elevated into something approaching literature. His fools, like Feste and Twelfth Night and the Fool in King Lear, were recognizably descended from court jesters, but operated with a sophistication and self-awareness that would have been impossible in the medieval system. Shakespeare's innovation wasn't just literary, it was economic. Instead of depending on royal patronage, he created entertainment that could generate revenue from multiple sources: ticket sales from diverse audiences, publication rights, royal performances, and private commissions. He proved that former jester functions could be profitable without the personal risks that had made the medieval version so dangerous. Then there were the commedia dell'arte performers who revolutionized the entire concept of comedic entertainment. Companies like the Gelozzi troupe turned improvisation from a survival skill into an art form. Instead of one jester adapting to one monarch's personality, these performers developed standardized characters: the clever servant, the pompous master, the naive lover, that could be deployed in countless combinations and scenarios. It was like creating a comedic alphabet that could spell unlimited entertainment possibilities. The key innovation was making comedy repeatable and teachable. Medieval jesters had been essentially unique artists whose skills died with them. Commedia dell'arte created a system where comedic techniques could be passed down, refined, and adapted by new generations of performers. This transformed entertainment from a personal service into a cultural institution. Perhaps most importantly, new players emerged who weren't performers at all but managed, funded, and organized entertainment. Theater owners, publishing entrepreneurs, and what we'd now call producers began treating comedy as a business rather than a royal service. These intermediaries understood that entertainment could be profitable if it was organized efficiently and marketed effectively to the right audiences. The role of women in entertainment expanded dramatically during this period. While medieval courts had occasionally employed female jesters, they were rare and usually operated under significant restrictions. Renaissance entertainment created opportunities for actresses, female writers, and female entrepreneurs who could participate in the industry on more equal terms with their male colleagues. Religious authorities adapted their approach to comedy as well. Instead of simply opposing all forms of secular entertainment, the Counter-Reformation Catholic Church began creating its own forms of religious comedy and satirical content designed to compete with Protestant propaganda. Jesuit schools became centers for developing sophisticated, dramatic entertainment that served religious purposes while employing many of the techniques that court jesters had pioneered. Most significantly, audiences became active participants in shaping entertainment rather than passive consumers. Theater audiences could show approval or disapproval immediately and dramatically, creating feedback loops that allowed performers to refine their material in real time. This democratized the entertainment development process in ways that would have been impossible under the old system of exclusive royal patronage. But some problems persisted that proved remarkably resistant to technological and social change. The fundamental tension between truth-telling and entertainment, which had nearly gotten countless medieval jesters executed, remained just as dangerous in the new system. Satirical writers and performers still had to navigate the delicate balance between making audiences laugh and avoiding political persecution, except now they had to satisfy multiple authorities instead of just one. Paranoid monarch censorship evolved rather than disappearing. Instead of worrying about one king's reaction to their material, entertainers now faced complex webs of religious authorities, government censors, guild regulations, and local magistrates, each with their own standards and enforcement mechanisms. A joke that was perfectly acceptable in Protestant London might be heretical in Catholic Rome, and material that delighted urban audiences might be considered scandalous in rural communities. The old system's clarity, please the king or die, was replaced by a bewildering maze of overlapping and often contradictory restrictions. The economic insecurity that had always plagued entertainers actually got worse in some ways. Medieval jesters might have faced execution, but successful ones enjoyed steady employment and clear hierarchical protection. Renaissance entertainers faced the constant uncertainty of market competition, changing audience tastes, and economic downturns that could destroy entire entertainment industries overnight. The plague closures that repeatedly shut down London theaters in the late 1500s demonstrated how vulnerable the new entertainment economy was to external disruptions. New versions of old problems emerged that were often more psychologically challenging than their medieval predecessors. Instead of one clear enemy, royal displeasure, performers faced diffuse criticism from multiple sources. Instead of immediate, dramatic consequences for failure, they experienced gradual career decline that could be harder to recognize and address. Instead of personal relationships with powerful patrons, they dealt with impersonal market forces that were impossible to negotiate with or influence directly. The class dynamics that had always complicated entertainment careers became even more complex. Medieval jesters had been social outcasts who could sometimes achieve influence through their unique access to royal favor. Renaissance entertainers occupied an ambiguous social position between respectable professionals and disreputable vagabonds. They weren't quite legitimate enough to be considered artists, but they weren't quite disreputable enough to be dismissed as mere criminals or beggars. Why certain issues proved intractable becomes clear when you consider that they reflected fundamental contradictions in how societies organize entertainment, authority, and social criticism. People want entertainers who can make them laugh at their problems, but they also want to maintain social stability and respect for authority. Audiences demand novelty and surprise, but they also expect familiarity and comfort. Performers need creative freedom to develop their skills, but they also need economic security to survive professionally. The cyclical patterns that had characterized medieval jester careers continued in new forms. Performers would achieve success, become popular enough to attract official attention, face pressure to tone down their material or modify their approach, either adapt and lose their edge or resist and face professional consequences, and then be replaced by new performers who hadn't yet been domesticated by success. The names and technologies changed, but the underlying dynamic of entertainment challenging authority and then being absorbed or expelled by it remained remarkably consistent. These persistent problems suggest that the challenges facing medieval jesters weren't unique to their time period or political system. They were inherent in the entertainment profession itself. Compared to their medieval predecessors, Renaissance entertainers operated in a world that was simultaneously more free and more constrained, more democratic and more elitist, more profitable and more precarious. The differences reveal just how much the profession had evolved, while the underlying challenges remained surprisingly constant. What was unique about the Renaissance transformation was the speed and scope of change. Medieval jester traditions had developed gradually over centuries, allowing performers and audiences to adapt slowly to evolving expectations and opportunities. The printing press revolution compressed similar changes into a few decades, forcing rapid adaptation that not everyone could manage successfully. The Renaissance also marked the first time that entertainment became truly international rather than local. Medieval jesters had occasionally traveled between courts, but their audiences were generally limited to specific social classes within particular geographic regions. Renaissance entertainment could reach audiences across national boundaries, social classes, and cultural backgrounds, creating opportunities for influence and success that would have been impossible in earlier eras. What was universal across both periods was the fundamental dynamic between entertainers and authority. Whether dealing with one paranoid monarch or multiple competing power centers, performers still had to navigate the dangerous territory between truth-telling and survival. The techniques changed, but the core challenge remained the same. How to make people laugh at their problems without becoming a problem yourself. The lessons that could be learned from comparing these periods are still relevant to modern entertainers and content creators. The most successful performers in both eras were those who understood that their primary job wasn't just making people laugh. It was helping audiences process difficult emotions, social tensions, and psychological conflicts in ways that felt safe and manageable. The specific forms changed, but the psychological functions remained constant. Renaissance entertainers who thrived were those who recognized that technological and social changes created new opportunities rather than just new obstacles. Instead of trying to recreate medieval jester relationships in a print media world, successful performers developed new approaches that leveraged the advantages of mass audiences, repeatability, and reduced personal risk while finding ways to maintain the intimacy and psychological insight that had made medieval jesters effective. The patterns that repeated across different historical contexts suggest that entertainment serves essential social functions that persist regardless of technological or political changes. People need ways to laugh at their fears, mock their oppressors, and imagine alternatives to their current circumstances. They need psychological pressure valves that allow them to process stress and frustration without resorting to violence or despair. They need social commentary that helps them understand complex political and economic forces in emotionally accessible ways. The specific mechanisms for providing these services change with technology and social organization, but the underlying human needs remain constant. This suggests that understanding the history of entertainment professions like court jesters can provide insights into how modern content creators, comedians, and social critics can navigate their own professional challenges. By 1650, the writing was on the wall for traditional court jesters, though ironically, most of that writing was now literally on walls in the form of printed broadsheets, satirical pamphlets, and underground newspapers that were doing the jester's job better, safer, and cheaper than any human performer could manage. The signs of impending obsolescence were everywhere, but like passengers on the Titanic arguing about deck chair arrangements, many jesters seemed determined to ignore the obvious. The most telling sign was that younger members of royal families were no longer requesting personal jesters. Instead of wanting their own Will Sommers, they were asking for access to libraries, theaters, and the latest publications from London, Paris, or Rome. The generation that had grown up with printed entertainment found the idea of having one person responsible for all their comedic needs as limiting as we'd find having only one TV channel. Why settle for whatever jokes your personal jester could come up with when you could access the best satirical content from across Europe? Smart court observers could see what key players were missing. The most successful entertainers were already transitioning away from exclusive royal service toward what we now recognize as freelance careers. They were writing for multiple publications, performing in public theaters, and building audiences that weren't dependent on royal favor. The jesters, who were still trying to land traditional court positions, were essentially competing for jobs that were disappearing even as they pursued them. What the traditional jesters missed was that their former employers were becoming less relevant to the entertainment ecosystem. Kings and nobles who'd once been the primary audience for sophisticated comedy were being overshadowed by growing urban populations with disposable income and literacy skills. A successful satirical pamphlet could reach thousands of readers and generate more income than a year of exclusive royal service, with dramatically less personal risk. The resistance to these inevitable changes came predictably from the jesters themselves, many of whom had spent decades perfecting skills that were becoming obsolete. They'd learned to read royal psychology, navigate court politics, and survive in environments where a poorly timed joke could mean death. These were incredibly sophisticated abilities that had no obvious application in the emerging mass entertainment market, where success depended on appealing to anonymous audiences rather than managing specific powerful individuals. Royal courts were also resistant to change, but for different reasons. Many older monarchs had genuine emotional attachments to their jesters and weren't ready to admit that this form of entertainment was becoming anachronistic. They continued employing traditional jesters long after it made practical sense, partly from nostalgia and partly from reluctance, to acknowledge that their courts were becoming less culturally influential than urban theaters and publishing centers. That their courts were becoming less culturally influential than urban theaters and publishing centers. Final warning sign was that younger jesters were already calling themselves by different names: actors, writers, satirists, or performers, and distancing themselves from the traditional jester label, which was beginning to carry connotations of outdated servility rather than professional entertainment skill. The final curtain fell on the age of court jesters, not with a dramatic execution or royal decree, but with something far more mundane and devastating: bureaucratic reorganization. Between 1650 and 1700, European courts began modernizing their staff structures, eliminating positions that seemed frivolous or outdated in an era of increasing political complexity and financial pressure. Court jesters were among the first casualties of what we'd now call corporate downsizing. The last officially employed court jester in England was probably Geoffrey Hudson, who served Charles I until the English Civil War made royal entertainment seem not just inappropriate, but potentially treasonous. Hudson's career ended not because he failed at his job, but because the entire concept of absolute monarchy was being challenged by political forces that had no patience for the elaborate entertainments of a discredited royal system. When your boss's head is being measured for a chopping block, job security in royal service becomes somewhat theoretical. In France, the transformation was more gradual but equally final. Louis XIV, the Sun King, essentially replaced traditional jesters with an elaborate court ballet system that served similar psychological functions, but was more controllable and less potentially dangerous. Instead of one clever individual who might accidentally say something politically inconvenient, Louis created entertainment spectacles involving dozens of performers who were too busy coordinating their movements to improvise dangerous political Commentary. The specific events that marked the end varied by country, but the pattern was remarkably consistent. Traditional court positions were eliminated during political crises, financial emergencies, or administrative reforms. Sometimes former jesters were pensioned off or given alternative court positions, but more often they simply weren't replaced. When they died or retired, the transition was so gradual that there's no clear historical moment when the last court jester hung up his bells for the final time. The final major players in this dying profession were often shadows of their medieval predecessors. Instead of the psychologically sophisticated political operatives like Sommers, late-period court jesters were frequently reduced to simple entertainers who provided harmless amusement without the intellectual content or political edge that had made their predecessors influential. They've been domesticated out of relevance, like wolves bred into lapdogs. The last attempts to preserve the tradition were often pathetic rather than noble. Some courts tried to maintain jester positions by reducing them to ceremonial roles with no real entertainment function, essentially human decorations, who wore traditional costumes and performed scripted routines at official events. Others attempted to modernize the position by combining jester functions with other court roles, creating hybrid positions like royal secretary and occasional entertainer that satisfied no one and served no useful purpose. Perhaps most symbolic was the fate of the jester's traditional costume. The bells, pointed hats, and colorful clothing that had once signified a dangerous but necessary profession gradually became associated with children's entertainment, carnival performers, and eventually circus clowns. The transformation of the jester's image from sophisticated political operative to harmless children's entertainer perfectly captured how completely the profession's social function had changed. The final dramatic moment wasn't an execution or a retirement. It was the moment when jester became a historical curiosity rather than a living profession. Sometime in the early 1700s, the last person who genuinely understood how to navigate royal court politics through humor probably died without passing their knowledge to a successor, because there was no longer any practical application for those skills. The symbolic endpoints were appropriately anticlimactic. Court records simply stopped mentioning jester positions in their staff listings. Royal household budgets eliminated entertainment line items that had existed for centuries. The rooms in palaces that had once housed jesters were converted to other purposes or left empty. The profession didn't die dramatically. It simply faded away as quietly and gradually as medieval Latin or the belief in the divine right of kings, another victim of historical forces that made its continued existence impossible. The analysis of causes reveals that court jesters weren't killed by any single factor, but rather by a perfect storm of technological, political, and cultural changes that made their traditional role both unnecessary and impossible to sustain. The printing press revolution was certainly a major factor, but it was the broader transformation of European society that ultimately made the profession obsolete. Internal problems had been building for generations. The jester system depended on personal relationships between entertainers and monarchs, which created inherent instability. Every time a jester-friendly king died, their successor might have completely different entertainment preferences, political concerns, or psychological needs. This made long-term career planning impossible and created constant uncertainty for performers who'd invested years in developing relationships with specific royal patrons. The increasing professionalization of court administration also worked against traditional jesters. As governments became more bureaucratic and systematic, there was less room for the kind of informal influence that jesters had traditionally wielded. Royal advisors were expected to have formal qualifications, official positions, and clear responsibilities, rather than operating through humor and personal charm. External pressures were equally devastating. The rise of public theaters created competition that court entertainment couldn't match. Why would talented performers accept the restrictions and dangers of royal service when they could build larger audiences and achieve greater creative freedom in commercial entertainment? The best comedic talent was being drawn away from courts toward more lucrative and less dangerous opportunities. The role of individuals versus historical forces is particularly interesting in this context. While individual jesters like Sommers had achieved remarkable influence, they'd done so by exploiting structural conditions that were already disappearing. The political system that made their work possible, absolute monarchy with limited accountability and restricted information flow, was being undermined by broader changes in European society. What could have been done differently is a fascinating, counterfactual question. Some historians argue that jesters could have survived by adapting more quickly to changing conditions, perhaps by transitioning toward what we'd now call political consulting or media relations. Others suggest that the profession was doomed regardless of individual adaptation strategies because the underlying social functions it served were being replaced by more efficient alternatives. The inevitability versus contingency debate reveals how thoroughly the profession was trapped by historical circumstances. Even if specific jesters had made different choices, the broader forces that were reshaping European entertainment and politics would have eventually eliminated traditional court jester positions. The printing press, the growth of urban centers, the increasing literacy rates, the development of public theaters, the professionalization of government administration, and the gradual decline of absolute monarchy were all working against the continuation of a profession that depended on personal royal service. Perhaps most significantly, the social functions that jesters had served, providing psychological support for rulers, offering outlets for political criticism, and creating entertainment that processed social tensions, were being taken over by other institutions. Newspapers and pamphlets provided political commentary. Public theaters offered entertainment. Religious leaders and formal advisors handled royal psychological needs. And emerging democratic institutions created legitimate channels for expressing dissent. The court jester profession ended because it was no longer necessary for maintaining social stability or political functionality. The services it provided could be delivered more efficiently, safely, and democratically through other means that didn't require anyone to risk their life making jokes for paranoid monarchs. The immediate aftermath of the jester profession's disappearance was surprisingly uneventful. The royal courts that had employed jesters for centuries simply carried on without them. This lack of dramatic consequences was perhaps the most damning evidence that the profession had already become obsolete before it officially ended. If eliminating court jesters had created any significant problems for royal administration or court culture, someone would have tried to reinvent the position. Who stepped into the vacuum left by departing? Jesters varied by country and court, but the pattern was remarkably consistent. No one. Instead of replacing jesters with equivalent individuals, courts developed more systematic approaches to the functions jesters had served. Formal advisors handled political counsel, official entertainers managed court amusements, and published materials provided satirical content when desired. The short-term consequences were mostly economic rather than cultural. Former jesters who'd successfully transitioned to other entertainment careers often found themselves in better financial situations than they'd ever enjoyed in royal service. Those who hadn't adapted faced unemployment, but since there were relatively few traditional court jesters remaining by the end anyway, the social disruption was minimal. Contemporary reactions were mixed, but generally indifferent. Most people outside royal courts hadn't been directly affected by jester entertainment anyway, so the profession's disappearance wasn't particularly noticeable to the general population. The urban audiences that were driving the new entertainment economy were more interested in the latest theatrical productions, satirical publications, and public performances than in whatever had been happening in increasingly irrelevant royal courts down among the nobility. Reactions ranged from nostalgia to relief. Older nobles sometimes expressed regret at losing a traditional form of entertainment that connected them to their cultural heritage. Younger nobles were generally happy to be free from what they considered an embarrassing reminder of their ancestors' need for personal servants to make them laugh. The attempts at revival or continuation were half-hearted and unsuccessful. A few courts tried to maintain jester positions as purely ceremonial roles, but these experiments typically lasted only a few years before being quietly abandoned. The social and technological conditions that had made the profession viable were gone, and nostalgia alone wasn't sufficient to sustain what had once been a vital and dangerous career. The legacy of court jesters shaped entertainment and political discourse in ways that are still visible today, though most people don't realize. They're experiencing the evolutionary descendants of medieval comedians who once risked their lives making jokes about kings. Later generations viewed jesters through increasingly romanticized lenses, transforming them from dangerous political operatives into harmless comic figures suitable for children's stories and fairy tales. By the 1800s, the Romantic movement had completely reimagined what court jesters had been. Instead of the psychologically sophisticated manipulators who'd actually served medieval courts, popular culture created a mythical version of jesters as wise fools who spoke profound truths through innocent humor. This sanitized version became the foundation for countless literary works, operas, and eventually movies that portrayed jesters as noble truth-tellers fighting against corrupt authority rather than the complex survival artists they'd actually been. The specific influences on later entertainment developments were profound, but often unrecognized. The improvisational skills that jesters had developed to survive unpredictable royal moods became the foundation for commedia dell'arte, which influenced Shakespeare's comedies, which shaped English theater traditions, which eventually contributed to modern improvisational comedy and sketch shows. The direct line from Will Sommers trying not to get executed by Henry VIII to Saturday Night Live performers mocking presidents is clearer than most people realize. Jesters had also pioneered what we'd now call crowd work, the ability to read audience reactions in real time and adjust material accordingly. This skill became essential for all successful live entertainers, from vaudeville performers to modern stand-up comedians. The techniques that medieval jesters developed for handling hostile audiences, managing hecklers, and recovering from failed jokes are still taught in comedy classes today, though their violent origins are rarely mentioned. How later generations viewed the profession reveals more about their own anxieties than about historical reality. Victorian audiences, living in an era of strict social conventions and limited political expression, romanticized jesters as symbols of freedom and authenticity. They imagined medieval courts as places where honest criticism was welcomed and rewarded, projecting their own desires for social reform onto a historical period that had actually been far more repressive than their own. The myths versus realities that developed around jesters became part of broader cultural narratives about the relationship between entertainment and authority. The Romantic myth portrayed jesters as fearless truth-tellers who could say anything to anyone without consequences, which became a template for how many people think entertainment should function in democratic societies. The reality that jesters were constantly terrified, carefully calculating every word, and frequently executed for miscalculations was much less inspiring and therefore largely forgotten. Why the profession remained important to cultural memory despite its disappearance probably relates to deeper psychological needs that persist across historical periods. People want to believe that there are individuals brave enough to speak truth to power, clever enough to outwit authority figures, and resilient enough to survive in hostile environments. Jesters became symbols of these qualities, even though the historical reality was more about survival than heroism. The profession's influence on academic study has been significant but often overlooked. Medieval historians initially dismissed jesters as minor court functionaries unworthy of serious scholarly attention. Only in the late 20th century did researchers begin recognizing that jesters had been important political and cultural figures whose careers illuminate broader patterns of power, resistance, and social change. This academic rehabilitation paralleled broader cultural movements that emphasized the importance of previously marginalized voices and unofficial forms of political expression. Today, we can see echoes of medieval court jesters in virtually every form of political and social commentary, though the specific manifestations would probably confuse and terrify their historical predecessors. Late-night television hosts occupy a remarkably similar cultural position to court jesters. They're entertainers who are expected to comment on political events, mock authority figures, and provide psychological relief for audiences stressed by current events, but they do so from the safety of corporate employment rather than the vulnerability of personal royal service. The parallels are sometimes startlingly exact. Stephen Colbert, Trevor Noah, and John Oliver perform essentially the same social functions that Will Sommers provided for Henry VIII. They help their audiences process political anxiety through humor, offer alternative perspectives on current events, and create safe spaces for expressing frustration with authority figures. The main difference is that modern audiences choose their comedic commentators rather than having them assigned by royal appointment. And the consequences for poor performance are career damage rather than literal death. Social media has created new forms of court jester dynamics that would be instantly recognizable to medieval practitioners. Twitter comedians who gain massive followings by mocking politicians and celebrities operate in the same psychological territory as traveling jesters, building audiences through wit and timing while navigating the constant risk of saying something that triggers career-ending backlash. The difference is that medieval jesters worried about individual monarchs having them executed, while modern comedians worry about anonymous online mobs destroying their reputations. Political satirists like those on Saturday Night Live or The Daily Show have essentially industrialized the jester function, creating systematic approaches to the kind of political commentary that medieval jesters had to improvise individually. They have teams of writers, research departments, and legal protections that would have seemed like miraculous luxuries to performers who'd had to rely entirely on their own intelligence and quick thinking to survive. What hasn't changed about human nature is the fundamental need for entertainers who can make authority figures seem less frightening and more manageable. Whether it's a medieval peasant laughing at their king through a jester's performance or a modern viewer watching politicians get mocked on television, the psychological function is identical. Humor as a coping mechanism for dealing with powerful people who control your life but seem disconnected from your reality. The similar patterns in different contexts are remarkable. Modern comedians still have to navigate the tension between truth-telling and entertainment, still face pressure to avoid topics that might offend powerful people or important audience segments, and still struggle with the question of whether they have responsibilities beyond making people laugh. The technology has changed, but the fundamental dynamics remain the same. Medieval jesters had to read the room to avoid execution. Modern comedians have to read the room to avoid cancellation. Medieval jesters developed elaborate networks for sharing information and techniques. Modern comedians use social media and industry connections for similar purposes. Medieval jesters struggled with the contradiction of appearing foolish while being clever. Modern comedians face similar challenges in maintaining authenticity while building commercial success. Perhaps most significantly, both medieval and modern comedic commentators serve as unofficial outlets for political frustrations that can't be expressed through formal channels. Medieval peasants couldn't directly criticize their kings, so they enjoyed watching jesters do it safely through humor. Modern citizens often feel powerless to affect political processes, so they turn to comedic commentary that allows them to laugh at politicians rather than feeling helplessly angry about them. The lessons for contemporary issues are sobering. The same forces that eventually eliminated medieval court jesters, technological change, shifting power structures, and evolving audience expectations are continuously reshaping modern entertainment careers. Comedians who become too comfortable with their current platforms and audiences risk being overtaken by new forms of entertainment that better serve changing social needs. Most importantly, the jester tradition demonstrates that the entertainment industry has always been fundamentally political, whether performers acknowledge it or not. The choice of what to mock, how to mock it, and who gets to participate in the mocking process are inherently political decisions that shape how audiences think about power, authority, and social relationships. Even now, the court jester tradition influences multiple areas of modern life in ways that most people don't recognize or acknowledge. Academic study of medieval entertainment has revealed patterns of resistance, adaptation, and cultural change that inform current research in political science, psychology, and communications theory. The jester's role as a cultural mediator between authority and subjects provides models for understanding how modern media figures function in democratic societies. Popular culture remains obsessed with jester imagery and symbolism, though usually in sanitized forms that would be unrecognizable to actual medieval practitioners. From Batman's Joker to Shakespeare festivals to Renaissance fairs, modern audiences continue to be fascinated by figures who combine humor with danger, wisdom with foolishness, and entertainment with political commentary. Political discourse increasingly relies on comedic frameworks that directly descend from jester traditions. The use of humor to deflate pompous authority figures, the deployment of irony to highlight social contradictions, and the practice of using entertainment to make serious points accessible to broad audiences are all techniques that court jesters pioneered out of necessity and that modern commentators have refined into art forms. Social movements have adapted jester tactics for contemporary activism. Protesters who use humor, costumes, and theatrical performances to mock political opponents are essentially employing updated versions of medieval jester strategies. The difference is that modern practitioners can choose their targets and timing, rather than being trapped in personal service relationships with specific authority figures. Why people still care about a profession that disappeared centuries ago probably relates to enduring fantasies about the relationship between entertainment and power. In an era when most people feel powerless to influence political processes directly, the jester represents the appealing possibility that cleverness, humor, and moral courage can somehow overcome institutional authority. It's a comforting myth that continues to resonate even when historical evidence suggests that real jesters were more focused on survival than social reform. The enduring appeal of court jesters in modern culture reveals something important about our continued struggle with authority, entertainment, and the role of humor in processing social stress. We've created mythology around these historical figures that says more about our own desires and anxieties than about medieval reality, but that mythology serves important psychological functions for contemporary audiences. The romanticized version of jesters as fearless truth-tellers speaking wisdom to corrupt power provides a model for how many people wish modern entertainers and commentators would behave. We want comedians who are brave enough to challenge authority, clever enough to outwit powerful opponents, and resilient enough to survive backlash from their criticism. The fact that historical jesters were primarily focused on personal survival, rather than social reform, doesn't diminish the appeal of the ideal. They've come to represent modern entertainment industry dynamics, demonstrate both how much and how little has changed since medieval times. The fundamental tension between creative expression and commercial viability. The challenge of maintaining audience engagement while avoiding career-destroying controversy, and the difficulty of balancing entertainment value with social responsibility, are all issues that medieval jesters faced, and that modern performers continue to navigate. The technological and institutional changes that eliminated traditional court jesters also created new opportunities for similar functions to be performed through different mechanisms. Television, internet platforms, and social media have democratized access to audiences and reduced the personal risks associated with political commentary. But they've also created new forms of vulnerability and new types of powerful people who can destroy careers through different methods. Perhaps most importantly, the jester tradition demonstrates that entertainment has never been politically neutral. The decision to make people laugh is always also a decision about what should be laughed at, who deserves to be mocked, and how social tensions should be processed and resolved. Modern audiences who consume political comedy are participating in the same social processes that medieval audiences experienced when watching court jesters perform, even though the specific content and delivery mechanisms have evolved dramatically. The legacy of court jesters ultimately reminds us that the relationship between humor and power is always complex, dangerous, and essential for maintaining social stability. Whether delivered by a medieval fool in a royal court or a modern comedian on a television screen, entertainment that helps people cope with authority figures and social stress serves vital functions that persist across historical periods and technological changes. Looking back across the tumultuous centuries we've explored together, we've seen how court jesters evolved from desperate entertainers trying to avoid execution into sophisticated political operatives who shaped the course of European history, then gradually transformed into the foundation for virtually every form of modern comedy and political commentary. The major themes that emerged paint a picture of a profession that was simultaneously more important and more precarious than anyone at the time fully understood. The key patterns we discovered reveal how entertainment functions as a form of political resistance, psychological therapy, and social pressure valve, regardless of the specific historical context. Whether we were watching Will Sommers navigate Henry VIII's paranoid rages or observing traveling jesters create underground networks of satirical content, the fundamental dynamic remained consistent. People need ways to laugh at their problems, and societies need mechanisms for processing tension and criticism without resorting to violence. Our most surprising discoveries probably center around how genuinely sophisticated these entertainers were. The popular image of jesters as simple-minded fools telling harmless jokes turns out to be completely backwards. They were actually among the most psychologically astute, politically informed, and intellectually nimble people in medieval society. They had to be, because their survival depended on understanding human nature, reading social dynamics, and predicting political outcomes with greater accuracy than most formal advisors achieved. The most important takeaways from this journey relate to how entertainment and politics have always been inseparably connected. The idea that comedy should be politically neutral, or that entertainers shouldn't comment on current events, would have seemed absurd to medieval audiences, who understood that humor was inherently political and that entertainers inevitably shaped how people thought about authority, power, and social relationships. How our understanding has evolved throughout this exploration reveals that the court jester profession was far more complex and influential than traditional historical accounts suggested. What initially appeared to be a colorful but marginal aspect of medieval court life turned out to be a crucial mechanism for maintaining political stability, managing royal psychology, and providing outlets for social criticism that might otherwise have led to rebellion or revolution. The transformation of jesters from essential political figures to children's entertainers in popular culture represents a broader historical pattern where potentially dangerous forms of resistance get domesticated and sanitized over time. The same process that turned court jesters into harmless clowns has affected other forms of political expression, making it important to understand the original contexts and functions of cultural traditions before they get completely absorbed into mainstream mythology. Perhaps most significantly, the jester tradition demonstrates that humor has always been one of humanity's most powerful tools for surviving impossible circumstances, challenging authority figures, and maintaining sanity in environments that would otherwise be psychologically unbearable. The specific forms change with technology and social organization, but the underlying human needs that jesters served remain constant across historical periods. Let me leave you with one final story that perfectly encapsulates everything we've learned about the strange, dangerous, and utterly necessary world of medieval court jesters. It's the tale of Jacques Coeur, not himself a jester, but a French merchant who inadvertently demonstrated why the jester profession was both essential and doomed. In 1451, Jacques was one of the wealthiest men in Europe, having built a commercial empire that stretched from France to the Middle East. He was also one of the most politically influential, serving as a trusted advisor to King Charles VII. But Jacques made a crucial mistake that reveals everything about why medieval courts needed jesters. He forgot that being successful and being safe were two completely different things. When Jacques offered honest advice about royal finances and suggested that the king's spending habits were unsustainable, he discovered that speaking truth to power without the protective shield of humor was essentially suicidal. The king, faced with uncomfortable truths delivered in straightforward language, chose to see Jacques as a threat rather than an asset. Within months, Jacques was arrested on fabricated charges, his wealth was confiscated, and he died in exile. Here's what makes this story perfect for understanding jesters. If Jacques had been Will Sommers, he would have found a way to communicate the exact same financial advice through a comic routine about a mythical king who spent so much money on parties that he had to sell his crown to pay for the entertainment. The audience would have laughed, the king would have gotten a message, and Jacques would have lived to advise another day. This story reveals why the jester system worked for as long as it did, and also why it was ultimately doomed. The psychological mechanisms that made humor an effective delivery system for criticism. The way laughter disarms defensive reactions and makes uncomfortable truths more palatable only worked in personal relationships between specific individuals. Jacques and King Charles had a formal, official relationship that couldn't accommodate the kind of playful manipulation that made jester-monarch relationships successful. But the story also shows what we lost when the jester profession disappeared. Jacques Coeur was probably a more qualified financial advisor than any court jester could have been, but his expertise was useless because he couldn't deliver his insights in ways that royal psychology could accept. The professionalization of court administration eliminated the personal relationships that made jester influence possible, but it also eliminated mechanisms for communicating uncomfortable truths to powerful people who needed to hear them, but weren't psychologically equipped to handle direct criticism. The most memorable image from Jacques' story is him sitting in his prison cell, probably thinking about how different his fate might have been if he just learned to make the king laugh while delivering bad news about the royal budget. It's a perfect metaphor for the broader historical transition we've been exploring, the moment when formal expertise replaced emotional intelligence, when official qualifications became more important than personal relationships, and when societies chose efficiency over the messy but essential human connections that had made the Jester system possible. Jock Kerr died wealthy in everything except the one skill that might have saved his life: the ability to make powerful people laugh at their own mistakes. As we come to the end of our journey through the pointed hat halls of medieval comedy, it's worth reflecting on what these long-dead entertainers can teach us about our own relationships with humor, power, and survival. They faced impossible choices between honesty and safety, between artistic integrity and commercial success, between individual survival and social responsibility. Choices that every entertainer, commentator, and content creator still faces. Today, the court jesters we've met tonight weren't heroes or villains, but complex human beings, trying to make the best of circumstances that would challenge anyone's moral courage and creative intelligence. They developed techniques for speaking truth through laughter, for building influence through apparent powerlessness, and for maintaining dignity while wearing ridiculous costumes and pretending to be fools. Their world may seem remote from our own, but the fundamental human needs they served, the desire to laugh at our fears, mock our oppressors, and imagine better alternatives to our current circumstances, remain as relevant today as they were 6 centuries ago. So the next time you watch a comedian make fun of a politician, enjoy a satirical news show, or laugh at a meme mocking authority figures, remember that you're participating in a tradition that stretches back to brave, clever, and slightly crazy entertainers who risked everything to make people laugh when laughter was one of the few forms of resistance available. The bells may have stopped ringing, but the echo of their humor continues to resonate through every joke that challenges power, every laugh that defies authority, and every moment when comedy helps us cope with circumstances beyond our control. Sweet dreams, and may your own encounters with authority be blessed with the wisdom, timing, and survival instincts of history's greatest fools. In these quiet moments after our exploration, there's something profoundly moving about the realization that the human need for humor in the face of adversity has remained constant across centuries of technological, political, and social change. The court jesters we've encountered weren't just historical curiosities. They were early practitioners of psychological and social skills that we still desperately need today. Their legacy reminds us that laughter isn't just entertainment. It's a survival tool that allows people to process trauma, resist oppression, and maintain hope in seemingly hopeless circumstances. When Sommers made Henry VIII laugh at his own contradictions, he wasn't just providing comic relief. He was performing a form of primitive therapy that helped an unstable monarch function well enough to avoid complete psychological breakdown. When traveling jesters helped village audiences laugh at corrupt tax collectors and hypocritical priests, they weren't just spreading gossip. They were providing communities with ways to maintain their dignity and sanity under oppressive conditions. Transformation of these sophisticated political operatives into the harmless clowns of modern imagination represents a broader cultural process where we sanitize and domesticate forms of resistance that were once genuinely dangerous and transformative. Understanding the real history of court jesters helps us recognize similar patterns in our own entertainment culture, where comedians and satirists who appear to be harmless entertainers are actually performing essential social functions that help maintain democratic discourse and political stability. The courage required to be a medieval court jester, the willingness to risk your life making jokes for people who could have you executed on a whim, puts modern complaints about comedy being too dangerous or controversial into perspective. These entertainers faced actual physical consequences for their artistic choices, yet they continued developing increasingly sophisticated techniques for speaking truth through humor because they understood that somebody had to find ways to help people laugh at their problems, their professional challenges, balancing honesty with diplomacy, maintaining artistic integrity while ensuring personal survival. building audiences while navigating hostile authorities, remain remarkably relevant to anyone working in creative fields today. The specific risks have changed, but the fundamental tensions between artistic expression and practical constraints persist across historical periods. Perhaps most importantly, the jester tradition demonstrates that entertainment has never been politically neutral, and attempts to treat it as such reflect misunderstandings about how humor actually functions in human societies. Comedy always involves choices about what deserves to be mocked, who has the right to participate in that mocking, and how social tensions should be processed and resolved. Medieval audiences understood this intuitively, which is why they took their jesters seriously, even while laughing at their performances. The gradual disappearance of the court jester profession reminds us that cultural traditions, no matter how deeply embedded they seem, can vanish completely when the conditions that created them change. But it also demonstrates that the human needs those traditions served don't disappear. They just get channeled through different mechanisms and institutions. The psychological functions that court jesters provided didn't become unnecessary when the profession ended. They were redistributed among other forms of entertainment and social commentary that emerged to fill the vacuum. Looking back across the centuries we've explored, what strikes me most powerfully is how these entertainers managed to maintain their humanity while operating in dehumanizing circumstances. They found ways to create genuine connections with audiences and employers who often saw them as disposable commodities. They developed artistic voices that remained authentic even when they were performing under extreme external pressure. They built professional communities and support networks that helped them survive in a hostile environment. Their example suggests that it's possible to maintain creative integrity and personal dignity, even in circumstances that seem designed to crush both. They proved that humor can be a form of resistance, that entertainment can serve social justice, and that making people laugh is work worthy of respect and historical memory. As we drift away from their world and back toward our own, we carry with us the knowledge that every laugh they inspired, every moment of relief they provided, and every truth they managed to communicate through humor was an act of courage that helped make human civilization a little more bearable for the people who had to live through it. That's not a bad legacy for a profession that history almost forgot. And it's a reminder that the entertainers who make us laugh today are carrying forward a tradition that's far more important than it might appear on the surface.